This is the Netherlands, a charming country adorned with windmills, tulip gardens, and, coffee houses. The country is viewed by many as a highly progressive place that enforces some truly modern policies. It boasts a remarkably strong social welfare network, offering universal medical care, solid retirement programs, and benefits for parental leave. And these types of systems are reflected in other sectors, too. The country maintains relatively steep taxation, and its worker protections are so strong that people often joke it's nearly impossible to lose your job in the Netherlands. So, this might seem like a progressive utopia, right? Well, it would if it wasn't concealing a rather unpleasant truth. This postcard-worthy little country is, according to the World Bank, the most unequal place on the planet, and the scale of this imbalance is absolutely astonishing. We've covered South Africa on this channel before, which typically carries that unfortunate reputation. And if you were to ask Google this question, it's the answer you'd probably find, but that's not the entire picture. When it comes to wealth disparity in recent times, South Africa has been relatively modest. The Netherlands, on the other hand, stands alone as the only nation more unequal than the world itself. So what exactly is happening here? Policies similar to those long practiced in the Netherlands are now being suggested by lawmakers in nations such as the United States to tackle the challenge of wealth disparity. But when we examine the outcomes, it doesn't appear they will achieve that at all. To truly grasp this, we're going to, as usual, explore a few core questions. How did the Netherlands, of all countries, transform into the capital of inequality? What insights does this reveal about the essence of wealth in the modern era? And how might this guide us in shaping stronger economic systems that aim to uplift everyone? Naturally, since we're here, we'll treat this as another country episode and add the Netherlands to the Economics Explained leaderboard. Now, inequality is a peculiar topic. There are countless ways to measure it and tools we rely on to interpret it, but beyond the data, there's no denying that it's deeply divisive. The previous time we examined inequality on this channel, we tried to impartially determine whether it produced harmful effects on long-term economic growth. Our conclusion was yes, maybe, depending on certain variables and situations, so basically, the most non-committal response we could possibly offer based on existing studies. And it remains the most disliked upload on the channel by a wide margin. So saying that people take this matter seriously would honestly be a bit of an understatement. But fair enough. It's a genuine concern that warrants thoughtful consideration by leaders across the globe. Yet the trick to earning that consideration lies in grasping what these policymakers are actually evaluating. The equality within nations is assessed using something known as a Gini coefficient. Now, people may have come across this phrase before or seen graphs like these, but still might not fully comprehend what it genuinely represents. So to simplify things, imagine an economy containing 3 people and $3 of total income earned each year. A perfectly balanced structure would have every individual receiving exactly $1 apiece. If we then examined the running total for each person, it would create a flawless YX diagonal. The income of one person is $1. The combined income of the first and second is $2, and the earnings of all 3 people together with the first and second equal $3. Truly mind-blowing stuff. I know, this idealized world of fairness would show a Gini coefficient of 0, signifying that everyone earns precisely the identical amount. Nice. But now let's imagine the opposite scenario, where all $3 end up with only one of the 3 people. In that case, this imaginary economy would carry a Gini coefficient of 1, meaning the system could not possibly become more unequal, as a single person possesses all the wealth. Of course, in reality, real-world economies have many more people and much more money in circulation, so the actual figure usually includes far more decimals, but always falls somewhere within this scale of 0 to 1. All right, so that's the Gini coefficient. For most viewers, I doubt there were any major revelations there, but this number can actually be used to measure 2 separate things: income inequality and wealth inequality. Naturally, income inequality tends to attract much of the focus, with people complaining about how a CEO makes 300 times more than the average employee or something like that. But in truth, income inequality is simply the engine that fuels wealth inequality. Individuals who earn higher incomes can, of course, save larger amounts, and those savings expand over time when invested wisely. But if earnings were distributed more evenly, that should stop the process at its origin, right? It should block the flow of income creating that wealth gap, correct? Well, perhaps. But that idea may need to stand against the lessons of the Dutch. The Netherlands closely resembles nations like Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and yes, naturally, Norway, in that their social policies are quite robust and financed through taxes that are rather high. That's why, if we consult the World Bank's data on income inequality, all of these countries rank remarkably low. Still, even with the clear link between income and wealth, all of these countries experience extremely high levels of wealth inequality. Of course, none reach the same extent as the Netherlands. But even a country like Sweden, often celebrated as the model of democratic socialism, shows a higher rate of wealth inequality than the United States, Brazil, or India. So how is that even possible? How are wealthy individuals managing to hold on to such a massive share of their nation's total wealth while only collecting a relatively small slice of its overall income? Well, to figure that out, we actually need to look at the group that usually receives the least focus: the poorest households. Unlike income, where the lowest you can earn in a year after taxes is zero, your net worth can actually be negative. Take someone buried in student debt who doesn't own a car or a home and has almost no savings. That person would have a negative net worth. Now, in the Netherlands, this isn't such a major issue when it comes to education, because tuition is heavily subsidized. But that doesn't mean people don't accumulate other forms of debt. In fact, they tend to take on debt on a much larger scale, through housing loans. For audiences in most countries, getting a mortgage normally means saving for a down payment so that you own part of the property yourself. Most banks worldwide expect at least a 20% deposit, and at an absolute minimum around 5%, to make sure borrowers have some skin in the game and are more likely to repay what they owe. This typically means that if you own a house, even with a large mortgage, you still likely have a positive net worth, since the property as an asset is worth more than the liability of the loan. So, unless you've racked up other debts or your home value has dropped sharply, you should still be in the green. That's not the situation in the Netherlands, where borrowers can and are actually encouraged to take loans that equal or even exceed 100% of the home's value. The National Mortgage Guarantee is a government initiative that backs up these loans. If the borrower defaults and the bank can't recover enough money by repossessing and selling the house, no problem. The government simply cuts the bank a check for the difference, effectively making mortgages nearly risk-free. This situation is actually intensified by the fact that mortgage interest payments in the Netherlands are tax-deductible. In other words, if you earn $100,000 in a year but pay $40,000 in interest on your home loan, you're only taxed as though you earned $60,000. This impacts wealth inequality in two important ways. First, it distorts how high taxes are felt. If individuals can claim major deductions on large incomes through hefty mortgages, then the actual tax rate becomes far less meaningful. That money can simply be redirected into growing a real estate portfolio. Second, it pushes people to take on more debt. Until not long ago, borrowers could actually secure loans worth up to 110% of their home's value. So if a young couple bought a $300,000 family home, they could borrow an extra $30,000 on top, instantly giving them a net worth of negative $30,000. As a result, a significant portion of the population technically owes more than their houses are worth. And in the Netherlands, that's perfectly acceptable. This exposes one of the main weaknesses of using the Gini coefficient as a simple measure. Dutch citizens, even those with negative net worths, generally enjoy very comfortable lives. Yet the data alone might make it seem like the country is some oppressive dystopia, full of peasants barely surviving under a ruling class of billionaires. But obviously, that's not what's really happening. Access to credit, when used responsibly, can be one of the most powerful drivers of upward mobility in any economy. At the same time, though, it can also widen wealth inequality beyond what normal government policies can manage. To illustrate this, Donald Trump once joked that a homeless man on the street was 900 million richer than he was because he was buried in debt at the time. Yet despite that, his life was clearly far more comfortable than the man on the streets, and no serious economist would have labeled him the poorest American, though I'm sure the comment section will, and I already regret mentioning it. The key takeaway here is that negative net worth doesn't always equal poverty, but it certainly makes the statistics look that way. So, does that fully explain the puzzle of Dutch inequality? Not exactly. It's definitely a major factor. But it doesn't tell the entire story. In fact, this severe wealth imbalance might actually be the natural result of mature capitalism. The Netherlands was the first country in history that economists could clearly identify as practicing capitalism in its modern form. Sure, systems of trade have existed for thousands of years throughout human civilization, but in most of those societies, economic output was determined by rulers rather than by consumers. In our video about the Dutch East India Company, we discovered that the Netherlands introduced remarkably modern concepts such as stock exchanges, limited liability corporations, and speculative financial assets as early as the 1600s. Since then, the Dutch economy hasn't really undergone much disruption to that framework over the last 4 centuries. That's not to say there haven't been wars, revolts, or the usual European political drama. Of course there have. But the point is that if you were wealthy in the Netherlands, you could continue transferring that fortune across generations without worrying about it being confiscated or destroyed along the way. That's why the wealth in the Netherlands is very old money. The nation's affluent. Individuals, to be fair, aren't extraordinarily rich, not compared to billionaires in the United States, China, or Russia anyway. However, if we examine the wealthiest individual in the country, Charlene de Carvalho Heineken, we can learn a great deal about how Dutch wealth actually operates. She's 66 years old and, unsurprisingly, made her fortune in the beer industry. Although she didn't establish the company herself, neither did her father, nor his father, and even her great-grandfather didn't truly found the Heineken brand we know today. He merely persuaded his wealthy parents to purchase a brewery using the family's fortune and then decided to put his own name on. That ancestral wealth can actually be traced all the way back to the Dutch East India Company. What this shows is that income taxation has absolutely no effect on curbing this kind of wealth. Income? Ha! This family hasn't earned a paycheck since Napoleon was still in nappies. Money generates more money. And the single greatest factor in compounding wealth is time itself. Usually, this natural force is limited by having to divide assets among several heirs who will eventually waste much of the inheritance. But European aristocrats often approach things quite differently. This is, of course, a broad generalization, but the majority of the estate is typically passed to one chosen successor who is carefully trained to keep the family's holdings secure and discreet. The other siblings still enjoy extremely comfortable lives, but the fortune isn't divided evenly like it was with, say, the Waltons. When you combine that with centuries of uninterrupted accumulation, the results can get pretty astonishing. Think about this. Would you rather see a 100% annual return on your investments, doubling them every year, for 10 consecutive years, or a 10% annual return, closer to historical market averages, over a full century? Let's assume everything compounds yearly, and both investors start with the same $10,000 just to keep things simple. Our first investor, with the 10-year plan, would grow that $10,000 into $10,140,000. An impressive pile of gains. But the patient investor, earning 10% annually for 100 years, would end up with $137,806,123.40, even after inflation, far superior to the first example's unrealistic returns. Time in the market beats timing the market. And after 400 years of compounding, you're bound to see extreme concentrations of wealth. So, does this imply that capitalism naturally grows more unequal as generations pass? Well, yes, most likely. The effect might be milder in nations without these dynastic inheritance structures, and philanthropic moves like the giving pledge among ultra-rich families can certainly help soften it. But as we've seen with the Netherlands, it's not the billionaires sitting atop the Forbes rankings who move the needle. It's the countless old money families deliberately keeping themselves out of the spotlight. So, is that actually a problem? Well, maybe not. I'd definitely prefer being in the bottom 10% of the Netherlands than in the bottom 10% of Ethiopia, which technically scores far better on the Gini scale. In fact, I'd even take the lowest 10% in the Netherlands over the top 10% in Ethiopia any day. That comparison shows that inequality doesn't automatically lead to hardship. As long as fair systems exist that genuinely give everyone a chance to climb, and that ordinary people's comfort, safety, and well-being aren't sacrificed just to enrich a privileged few. I think that sentence somehow managed to irritate people on both political sides. Please like the video. I'm pretty sure I'll need it to balance out the incoming dislikes. Ranking all right. On to the fun part. It's time to add the Netherlands to our Economics Explained global leaderboard. But before that, I'm removing California since U.S. states are now getting a separate list. Also, our Texas video was one of the poorest performing releases this year, so maybe hold off on suggesting your home state until that one cracks at least 200,000 views. Gotta follow the data here. Okay, self-pity aside, the Netherlands boasts a large, sophisticated economy with a GDP of $914 billion USD, earning it a 7 out of 10, just shy of joining the $1 trillion club.